Hello, my name is Corey McAvoy, and this is a presentation and tutorial on Typesafe Redux. Typesafe Redux is basically just an approach of hooking up Redux with Typescript. Typescript provides great type safety and it ensures a great developer experience. Personally, I go in and out of code bases every single day, and when I go into apps that are hooked up with TypeScript, it is a great experience because there's IntelliSense, autocomplete, error detection, and linting. If I go into code bases that are not type safe, it's just a huge burden on the brain. So I'm a big fan of type safety, and this is an example of Redux with type safety. So for this video, the target audience for this video is someone that has a basic knowledge of React and Redux. I'm not going to go over these technologies individually, so it's an assumption that you're kind of already familiar with both of these. It's also helpful if you have a minimum knowledge of TypeScript. If not, that's totally fine. You just kind of pick up the concepts as we go along here. For this video, what's in scope is app-specific entities that we will hook up to TypeScript, such as to-do items, employees, customers, expenses, stuff like that. Redux actions, Redux reducers, the Redux store, and we're going to use one middleware item called Redux Thunk. And then we're also going to hook up MapState to props and map dispatch to props to do the bolt-in component hookup with Redux. What's out of scope is selectors, such as using Redux Reselect and Redux Sagas. They were just a little bit too much to add to this video. I'd have to make the video much greater in length to cover these. But if you want to hook these up to TypeScript, I'd recommend just following the standard docs on how to do that. Okay, so an overview of TypeSafe Redux. So from a high level, TypeScript adds linting, error detection, autocomplete, and IntelliSense to your apps. So this is really helps when you're going in and out of code bases. And I'll show you a little snippet here in a second. Now the configuration of TypeSafe Redux is unopinionated. There's several different approaches to making this happen. I'm just showing you one approach, but feel free to experiment with other approaches that are out there. Now these libraries are evolving. So although I'm showing you a correct approach today, in the future, this could change, and that's just because TypeScript and Redux are just changing so rapidly that you may see different configurations in the future. Now with TypeSafe Redux, there is an extra setup effort. So that involves us going out and defining our types. So it does sound like there is more effort, but this greatly improves the developer experience. And you'll see just why here in a second. So above is a snapshot of a TypeSafe Redux application. This may seem familiar to you if you do a lot of Redux stuff. This is the MapState to props object that you essentially are defining variables that you're taking from your Redux store, and you're defining those to keys that you'll use throughout your app or your component. In this example, I'm just defining this off token variable, and I'm going through the state, and as you can see, there's a nice autocomplete here where basically the IDE is telling me all the different components within my store. So navigating around like this sort of autocomplete really helps reduce the brain burden that you have to do when you're interacting with these apps. So it's a huge help just from this perspective. Okay, so the workflow steps to hooking up Redux to a type-safe approach. The first step is to add any app-specific types, such as to-do items, expenses, customers. The next step is to create action types that go through to your reducers, such as edit expense and add expense and fetch expenses, etc. The next step is to create app state types, which is basically the architecture of your reducers. What variables does your reducer expect and stuff like that. The rest of the steps are just hooking up the types to Redux. So hooking up the types to Redux actions, hooking up the types to Redux reducers, and the store, and any sort of middleware, which we're going to use Thunk for this tutorial. And the last step is to hook up the types to your React component integration using the MapState to props and MapDispatch to props methods. And that's really it for actually hooking it up. So we're going to do a little tutorial on this. It's going to be just a basic expense app. I'm not hooking up the UI in this tutorial because this is more of just a TypeScript Redux thing, so it's all code. And I'm going to have the start and finish code available on GitHub. So feel free to check the comments for that information and check that out. Okay, so now we're done with the presentation. Let's go ahead and move on to the coding tutorial. Okay, so here is the app, and if we kind of navigate around, we should see a ton of red in the application, and this is because it is not type safe yet, and I have defined all of my files to be .ts and .tsx. So just right there, my code editor is just going to throw up red tags all over the place and give me tons of errors. So I'm going to have to go through and make this all type safe. And once I do that, all these red lines should disappear. The first thing I'm going to do, if you remember from our presentation, is we are going to add app-specific types first. So for this app, it's just an expense app where you can add, remove, edit, and set expenses. That's the only app generic type that we're going to create here. So let's go ahead and create a new folder called types. And within here, create a new file. And I'm going to create one called expense.ts. Our expense is just going to be a very basic expense. And it's going to be an interface, which is a TypeScript definition. So we'll do export interface expense. And it's going to open up an object, and we're going to just do a few values here. ID of type string, description of type string, a note of type string, an amount of type number, and a created at value, which is, I'm also going to make a number as well. Which you do see this is pretty common with a lot of like timestamps. Is the developers will make this a number, which is like an epoch number, which is like the number of milliseconds from a certain date in the 70s, and then you just convert that to a date in the actual application. Okay, so I'll go ahead and save that, and that's our app-specific types. So we're done with that step. So if we go back to the presentation, we've finished this step. Now the next step is to create action types, such as edit expense and add expense, etc. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create another file under the types directory. We're going to call it actions.ts. And in actions, what we're going to do is we're going to define each one of our actions as a variable, and we're going to set that equal to whatever our action type is in a string format. So we'll do export const, and we'll do add expense. We'll set that equal to add expense. And we're going to do the same thing for 4 other actions. So we're going to do edit expense as well. Remove expense. And set expenses, which should be equivalent to like a fetch expenses. Okay. Now after that, we're going to export each action in an interface format, which is a TypeScript component. So we'll do export interface set expense action. And we're going to open that up, and we're going to do type, and then you're going to do type of, and then the variable up here. So set underscore expenses. And then for this, I'm also going to have an expenses parameter, and this is going to take our type that we had just defined earlier called expense. And in this situation, since it's multiple expenses, it'll actually be an array. And now I'll do another one. I'll do edit expense. So edit expense action. And this one's going to be edit expense. And this is going to be of type, or I'm going to have another parameter called expense. And this is going to be just the singleton expense rather than the array. Now I'll do the same thing for remove. So I'll make this remove expense action. And this is going to be remove expense. And this one's going to just take an ID rather than a whole expense type. So this is just going to be ID of type string. And then last, I'll do the add expense. So export interface add expense action. I'm going to open that up, and this is going to take type of add expense. And this is going to be type of. And in this case, it's just going to take one parameter called expense of type expense. All right, now that we've created each one of those, the next thing to do is to create a aggregation of all these. We're going to call that expense action types. So for that, I'm going to do export type expense action types, and I'm going to set the equal to set expense action, and I'm going to use an OR operator to aggregate all of these, and I'm going to do edit expense action, or remove expense action, or add expense action. Okay, now that I've completed that, I'm going to do another aggregation of all the different expense or all the different action types throughout the app, and I'm going to call this app action. Export type app actions equals expense action types. Now app actions is supposed to represent basically all the possible Redux actions throughout your application. In this case, we're only using expense action types, but in a real application, you probably have more here, such as like filter action types, or like customer action types. And then this would further populate the app action with all the possible actions through expense and filter and customer. But in this example, we're just doing expense, so you don't need that here. So I'll go ahead and save that. And now we're done with the action part. So if we go back here, steps 1 and 2 have completed. Now we'll do step 3, which is create app state types, which is the data in the reducers. So to do that, we're actually going to go to the Redux store in our configure store file, and you can come in here, and you can see that we're importing our reducer here, which we have not actually set up with type safety yet, but we'll do that here in a second. For now, what we're going to do is we're actually going to take this root reducer object, and we are going to we're basically going to get the types from it, and we're going to export that as our application state type that holds all the types throughout the state of our app. So to do that, we're going to do export type app state, and we're going to set that equal to something called return type, and it's going to take in a parameter called type of root reducer. So this return type is a TypeScript thing that essentially checks whatever's in the parameter and just returns, or just grabs the return type from whatever is in the parameter. The root reducer is something that we haven't hooked up to TypeScript yet, but we will soon. And it's essentially going to grab all the types from all our different reducers and store them into appstate, which is then our source of truth for all the application state throughout our Redux store. So I'll go ahead and save that, and that's it for that step. So the top 3 have been completed. Now we're just going to hook up everything to the types that we created. So the first one we're going to do is the Redux actions. So let's go back into our code editor and let's navigate up to the expense action file. So for each one of these, we're going to do 2 things. One, we're going to type out the parameter, and then we're going to specify a return type for each one of these. So to do that, I'll just next to the parameter, you just specify a colon and then whatever the type is. And then for this case, it's that expense type that we did at the very beginning of the video. And you're going to want to import that. And then we're going to specify a return type. The way you do that is after the list of parameters, you do a colon right after that. And I'm going to specify app actions, which again represents all the possible actions that our Redux store can take. And I'm going to do that to the rest of the 3 here. So this ID is going to be type string, and this is going to have a return value of app actions as well. Same thing with edit expense. This is going to be of type expense, and this is going to be a return type of app actions as well. And we'll do the same thing with this guy. Expenses is going to be an expense array, and return type of app actions as well. So these are now good to go. I do have some more items down here, but these are for the thunk part, so I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. So I'll save the file, and now I'll consider that step done. So the next thing we'll do is hook up the types in the Redux reducers. So let's go back to our code editor, and let's go to the reducers piece. So open up the expenses.ts, and as you can see, we've got a bunch of red under here. So the first thing we'll do is on this default state, we're going to create a type for it, and this should be expense and then array. And make sure you import expense from our types folder. Now we're also going to specify types for each one of our parameters. This state will infer the type from our definition up here, which is great. But this action one, we will need to define a type here. So do a colon, and then we're going to do expense action types, and make sure you import that. And then we're going to do a return type as well, and we're going to specify expense array, which is obviously the type of our reducer. Now I do want to do a little bit of a cleanup here. I'm doing an export default here, but I don't like that. I usually like to actually explicitly define my reducers, so I'm just going to change this to const expense reducer. You don't have to do this, but I just prefer it for syntax style. And then at the very bottom, I'll just export a singleton. Alright. And now that should be all I have to do for this to make it type safe. So this one was relatively easy. You just specify a type for the action parameter and a return type here. And obviously a type for the default state, which this state parameter infers from this. So I'll save that. And now that step is done. So step 5, hooking up the Redux reducers. The next step is hook up the types to Redux store. We kind of already did that, to be honest. So I'm going to skip that step, and I'm going to go to the thunk step. And some of this thunk step does actually involve the Redux store, so you'll see me actually go into that. So let's go back to the code editor. let's go back to the actions file. We're going to scroll down here. And on the start add expense, we're going to do the same thing that we did before, where we're going to give each one of the parameters a type. For this object, what you'll have to do is you can't actually do a colon here because that's the way you rename something. So in this case, we're just going to go after the curly brackets. We're going to add a colon and open up another object, and you actually define all your types in here. So I'll do description, colon, and this is going to be a string, and then note, colon, string, amount is going to be a number, and so we'll create it at. That'll also be a number. Created at number. I'll go ahead and save this, which Prettier is going to auto format just to make it a little bit easier to read. And now we have to do the thunk part. If you're not familiar with thunk, it just allows you to return an object within your action generator, and you're able to grab out the dispatch function from Redux and the get state function from Redux as well, which allows you to access your state. Now to hook this up with TypeScript, we're going to use something called the dispatch type, which comes from Redux. So if I type in dispatch, the code editor is going to give me some choices. Really important that you import dispatch from Redux rather than the React one. So make sure you do that. And this dispatch is going to take in a parameter, and it's going to be our app actions that we had defined, which again defines all the actions within our Redux store. And on this get state thing, this is going to take a type of actually a function, and that function is going to return appstate, which again is our a representation of all of our state in our Redux store. Okay, so that looks good. A little housekeeping here. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this object and I'm going to rename it to an expense data, just to make it a little bit cleaner down here. So I'll do expense data, so that should be set up appropriately. And this should be all set up with type safety. So I'll go ahead and do the same thing down in these other ones, on these other four. So this is going to be of type string. This dispatch is going to take a type of dispatch with a parameter of app actions, and this get state is going to be an object or a function that's going to return our app state. A little housekeeping here. Remove expense should not be taking in an object. It should just be the ID. And okay, so we'll do the same thing with start edit expense. It's going to be a type expense, dispatch, type dispatch, parameter of app actions. Get state is going to be a function that returns app state. And another housekeeping, this edit expense should be taking in just an expense. And we'll do the last one as well. So the start set expenses. This can be of type expense array. And we will make the dispatch of type dispatch. And this is going to be app actions as a parameter. And this get state will again be a function that returns app state. Alright, I'll save that, and that should be good to go. Now that that part of thunk is completed, we then have to do another piece in the store. And this is very important. Now in the store, there's a little alteration that we're going to do to the thunk piece. So instead of just specifying thunk here, which is imported from here, we are going to do thunk. We're going to specify as, which basically defines a new type. We're going to specify thunk middleware, which comes from the Redux thunk library. And this is going to take in two parameters. The first one is our application state, which again we created this appstate variable that specifies all the state in our Redux store. And then we're going to do an app actions type as well, which represents all the actions in our Redux store. And that should be all set up. A little bit of housekeeping here. On the expenses thing, if you recall correctly, we redid this to not do a default export. So this should actually be a named export called expense reducer. And just make sure you tidy that up in the combine reducers function as well. So I'll save that. And now Thunk should be all type safe now. So now we've completed steps 1 through 7. And the last step is to actually hook this up to our React component, which is actually the fun part. So let's come back to the code editor. We're going to go to our single component here in our app called homepage. And this isn't anything pretty. It's literally just a single component that's hooked up to our Redux store. So there's a few different things we're going to do in here. The first thing we're going to do is remove this expenses line. So a little bit of housekeeping there. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to specify types for the React component. And in this situation, this isn't Redux specific, but we need this as a prerequisite for our MapState to props and MapDispatch for props. So we'll just specify 2 interfaces here. We'll just do interface, and I'll just say home page props. And we're going to open this up. And just to give you some context, I'm going to specify 2 parameters, but we're not actually going to use it here. So I'll specify an ID, and I'm going to make this optional by doing a question mark colon, and it's going to be of type string. I'll do the same thing with another random one. I'll just call it color. It's also going to be optional, and that's going to be type string. Again, we're not actually using this. It's just to give you context on essentially what you would normally do here. We're going to specify an interface for the component state. So we'll do interface home page state. And this is actually going to be blank. I'm not going to specify anything here. And then we will add these types to our React component. So how you do that is on React.component, you just pass in 2 parameters, and that's home page props, comma, home page state. All right, that should be good to go. Now we're going to scroll down to the bottom to our MapState to props and MapDispatch to props. We've got a lot of red here, so there's a lot of things we can fix to make this type safe. So the way we do that is we'll have 2 interfaces. One interface that specifies the return values of MapState to props, and another one that specifies the return value of MapDispatch to props. So I'll specify interface, and I usually name this link state props. And I'm going to do another one called link dispatch props. Link state to props, or link state props, I'm just going to have one value here, and it's going to be expenses, and it's going to be of type expense, which again is that action we created at the beginning of the tutorial. It's going to be an array. And the link dispatch to props, this is going to be 2 different values. It's going to be the start edit expense and the start remove expense. So I'll specify start edit expense, and this is going to be of type function, which is going to have one parameter called expense, and this is going to be of type expense. And it's going to return void. That's what dispatch normally returns. And then we're going to do start remove expense. And this is also going to have a parameter of ID of type string. And it's going to return void as well. All right, now our interfaces have been created. Now we'll go into MapState to props, and we'll hook up this as well. Typically people, instead of calling this props, they actually call this own props. So I'll just specify there for to avoid confusion. And I'll give this a type of what we created up here, this homepage props. If you're not familiar with Redux, the second parameter here, onProps, this is essentially the props of your normal component, regardless of what you're sending in through Redux. So that's why we're specifying that type there. Now the state, what you're going to do, if you remember, we created a type called appstate that basically represents the entire state of our Redux store. So it makes sense to define the type appstate. So I'll import that, and that should be good to go. Now I'm going to also type out the map dispatch to props, and the same thing applies to the second parameter there. So I'll call this onProps and give this a type homepage props, although we aren't actually going to use it here. And dispatch, this type is actually going to be a little bit different. We're going to call this thunk dispatch. Normally you would do just dispatch, but since we're using thunk, we're actually going to do thunk dispatch, and you're going to import that from Redux thunk. This is going to take in 3 parameters. The first 2 are just going to be any, and you'll use any for the first 2 parameters for most configurations. Only some really advanced setups that you'll actually specify something here, so don't worry about that. The third parameter is the one that we care about, and in that one we're going to actually pass in our app actions. And obviously that app actions represents all the possible actions in a Redux store. So we'll save that. Now a little needs to change down here. So go ahead and remove these 2. And we're going to do start, edit, expense. And this is going to take in the value of a function called bind action creators. This is something that comes from Redux. So make sure you import that. And this is going to take in 2 parameters. One is our Redux thunk action that we specified in our expenses actions folder here. Select the start, edit, expense. So I'll do start, edit, expense. And the second parameter is just our dispatch parameter that we passed in. So this will be dispatch. All right, so that should be good to go. And I'll also do start, remove, expense. And this will be bind action creators again. And I'll do start, remove, expense, comment dispatch. All right, I'll save that. So that should be good to go. Displaying a little bit of the magic here. So like if let's say I wanted to grab some sort of item off of our store, maybe like obviously like expenses here, I can just do comma, and maybe I'll do like auth token, and I can do state dot. Obviously expenses are the only thing that we have right here, but you can do like state dot, whatever store you want, and you could dive down even farther if you wanted to. So I don't really need that here, so I'll just erase that. You can also do the same thing with that homepage props. So maybe I could do like ID, and I could do own props dot, and then whatever ID I specified for the component. So that's really, really easy and really, really convenient. Okay, so now let's come up here and just basically fix all this. So our function right here, it takes in a parameter of expense, but it's not typed up. So I'll just fix that. Same thing with this ID. This should be of type string. All right, so that should be good to go. Now we have a few other things that we see we need to fix. Obviously it says, this start edit expense does not exist on the type. The way we fix that is we specify another type that's going to be an aggregation of our homepage props and our link dispatch props and links state prop. So I'll just call that type props, and I'll set that equal to homepage props, and I'll do and link dispatch props, and then and link state prop. And then you just come down here and change this value to props. And magically, all the red lines go away. Now the last thing we have to do is we have to make sure that we specify a return type on MapState to props and map dispatch to props. And the return type is just going to be these interfaces that we created. So on MapState to props, we'll do colon and then link state prop. And then down here on map dispatch to props, we'll just do colon link dispatch props. All right, and that's it. And at this point, our app is completely 100% type safe. That concludes the tutorial for type safe Redux. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this type of content, subscribe and hit the bell notification to receive new updates on new videos. That's it. Talk to you later. Goodbye.